This episode is brought to you by Kia's first 3-row all-electric SUV, the Kia EV9, with available all-wheel drive and seating for up to 7 adults, with a 0 to 60 speed that thrills you 1 minute and available reclining lounge seats that unwind you the next. Visit kia.com/EV9 to learn more. Ask your Kia dealer for availability. No system, no matter how advanced, can compensate for all driver error and or driving conditions. Always drive safely.
Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast, your go-to source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development. We hope you tune in often for all things people management, organizational development and change, organizational leadership, and social impact related. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with Human Capital Innovations Podcast. Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. In this HCI podcast episode, I talk with Dr. Mark McLaughlin about cognitive dominance, dealing with stress, and improved decision-making. Dr. McLaughlin credits cognitive dominance with helping himself move past the common fear, freak-out problem, that deer in the headlights, feeling under pressure, that holds us all back from high performance. Again, what a wonderful opportunity to have this discussion with you today. And, you know, in leadership situations within organizations, it may not be literal life or death, you know, in terms of the person on the operating table, but a lot of people will be impacted by the types of decisions that organizational leaders make. And sometimes it's employment life or death. You know, these decisions will have ramifications for jobs and for effects on consumers and the health of the environment and all of this. So it's important to be able to learn to be unflappable amidst the high pressure, the high stakes types of environments that leaders will find themselves in. And so I'm excited to have the discussion with you today. Anything you would like to add by way of background, personal context, anything else before we really dive in?
Well, no, I think that was great. Thanks for the wonderful introduction. And like you said, a lot of people say, well, you know, I don't do brain surgery. This isn't the same kind of thing. And I agree with you completely. There's life and death of friendships. There's life and death of relationships. There's life and death of your position at work. So being able to think better and to understand how your brain works and to sort of retrain it so that it can think more effectively under pressure, I think is useful to everybody. And that's really what so why I wrote the book. I was a philosophy major in college, and I've always sort of liked to think outside the normal parameters of you know what we're doing. And after two decades in neurosurgery, I realized that, you know, neurosurgeons make a lot of really critical, stressful decisions, and I wanted to kind of share with people what I had learned from making all these decisions, because I feel that a lot of the decision-making algorithms and processes that you follow in neurosurgery, a lot of the rules and the basic core principles are really, they're touchstones of life that we can use for managing, you know, family issues and business issues and personal issues. So I'm delighted to be here and to talk with you, Jonathan.
Mark McLaughlin, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
My pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity to be able to chat with you. As we were discussing in the pre-interview, you know, I rarely would ever interview a medical doctor for this podcast, and I don't believe I've ever interviewed a neurosurgeon for the podcast, but you really have an interesting background and set of insights and skills that I think will be really useful to the listeners of this podcast. So I'm excited to have the discussion with you. Today, we're going to be focusing on the topic of cognitive dominance and how we can use that in dealing with stress and improving our decision-making capabilities in the workplace as leaders and in running and leading teams. As we get started, I just wanted to share Dr. McLaughlin's bio with everybody. Mark is no stranger to fear. A practicing board-certified neurosurgeon, he has helmed countless high-stakes surgeries in which any miscalculation could mean life or death. But decades performing under immense pressure in the operating room led him to a surprising discovery. The secret to success isn't just conquering fear, it's engaging with it more productively. In his new book, Cognitive Dominance, A Brain Surgeon's Quest to Outthink Fear, Dr. McLaughlin shares a new framework for dealing with fear to think and perform at the top of your game during stressful situations. He combines philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, and his own experiences to provide unique insights on how the brain processes fear and how we can change our mindset about this universal condition. Cognitive dominance is a way of thinking, a methodology to get better and better at quickly performing at the limits of your mental and physical capacity under maximum pressure with the highest probability of success. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, as we launch into the discussion today, I thought really we could just start with an overview of your conception of this idea of cognitive dominance. I shared a quote from your book already, so that framed it a bit, but what more can you tell the audience in terms of what you mean by cognitive dominance and why is it important?
Sure. It's sort of a daunting term. You would think it's almost like Darth Vaderish, we're going to dominate your cognitive thought process. And it's really nothing like that. It's really kind of just mastering your own mind. It's defined by the military as enhanced situational awareness that facilitates rapid and accurate decision-making under stressful conditions with limited decision-making time. And, that's a mouthful, but what it really means is becoming more effective when you're stressed out and you have limited information to make a decision. And so when I first heard it, I was giving a talk up at West Point to the cadets, and I was not familiar with the term, and I thought, wow, that's obviously that's a wonderful military term, but it's also neurosurgery. It's what we have to do on a day-to-day basis. If problems aren't delivered to you completely dissected with the algorithm to finish them off. You need to think and decide with limited time and information. But I thought more about it, and I thought, well, that's parenting. That's being a husband or a spouse. That's running a business. So all those decisions have to be made. And typically, what I saw as I was giving these talks is that we have an element of fear when we don't have all the information, when we don't have all the answers, and we have to make a move. And fear can be a vital ingredient in succeeding and actually performing better, but it can also be an Achilles heel for people, and it can inhibit good performance. So talking about fear, I thought would be an interesting concept, and particularly being a surgeon and a neurosurgeon, doctors and particularly surgeons don't usually talk about fear, but I can promise you every one of them has it. A lot of them suppress it. They wear a mask that says they don't experience it, and people would like to think that their doctors and their surgeons don't have fear, but they do. And I think getting it out in the open and talking about it and dissecting it is a really good thing. So in the book, what I talk about is something called a gradient of fear. And that involves really examining every aspect of fear. Because I've heard some people say, well, I don't have fear. I get anxious or I get nervous, but I'm not fearful. And that, to me, anxiety is just one level of fear. You can be mortified, you can be terrified, you can be nervous, you can be skeptical, you can be, there's a whole variance of different types of fear. To me, I think it's all a certain level of fear. And it happens when we experience something that we don't expect to experience. So that's the trigger that hits our brain and says, wait a minute, something that I thought was going to happen didn't just happen. And now I've got to deal with it. Whether that's getting a job promotion and thinking, oh my gosh, my life's going to be so much better now that I have a job promotion. And then you realize a couple days later, wait a minute, this is like not what I expected. This is more stressful for me, or the person that I'm now reporting to, I don't care for at all. Maybe this wasn't the best move for me. So that's when we start getting anxious, or, when I'm operating and I'm expecting to see a certain anatomy and I don't see it. So then that's an event that happens. It drops into my life and I've got to navigate through it. So that's really how the book starts, is it talks about how I experience something that I didn't expect to experience and how I dealt with it. Initially very poorly, and then began to kind of sort it out over my career.
Excellent. Thank you for that overview. And it's so interesting that you pull in this concept from the military, you apply it into your career as a neurosurgeon, and now you start to see all these implications and applications to other aspects of life. You mentioned being a parent. I think in friendships, just in work with our communities, we find ourselves in these types of high demand, high stress, high stakes types of environments often, and they manifest themselves in different ways. And people learn to deal with that stress, that anxiety, in different ways, and a lot of times in not particularly healthy or effective ways. And so learning to train our mind in such a way that we can learn to be unflappable in the face of danger, in the face of the pressure. I think that's really what leadership is all about, because it's not all of what leadership is about, but it's an important component, because leaders in organizations, they have pressure on them from all sides pretty much all the time, and it never goes away. You constantly have that weight on your shoulders. And you might get little moments of reprieve, but there's always different emergencies and fires to put out, and critical decisions that need to be made. And you're trying to stay agile, and you're trying to stay competitive in the market. And you're trying to do all these things that have implications for tons of people that look to you for that leadership, and who rely on you for your competency and your capabilities to make sure that the organization is successful. That's a lot. That's a big burden. That's a lot of weight to carry. And it can become debilitating to a lot of people. But we can interrupt those negative thought patterns. We can train ourselves to respond to those high tension moments, and calm our mind, and then be able to respond in a productive way. So what are some of the things that you found to help you as a neurosurgeon in your practice to be able to respond to those types of situations?
Sure. Just to go back a little bit to what you were talking about, which I completely agree with, is that, there are a lot of gray zones when you're running a business. I run a business too. As a doctor, I've got to, pay the bills and make sure the employees are taken care of, and everything is a finely oiled machine. And yet you're trying to cut costs. So you're trying to cut costs, but you don't want to cut quality, right? And that's a very important thing. And sometimes there's some real gray areas. And so one of the other concepts I talk about in the book is that, we're constantly toggling between something called cognitive consonance. That's when we're acting in the pursuit of all our ideals, and we know that our actions are consistent with our ideals. And then we're toggling between something called cognitive dissonance, which is when we have inconsistent thoughts and actions, and they're concerning to us because they may not completely jibe with some of our ideals. And that, to me, that's when you start slipping into this anxiety, this uncomfortableness, and when you're slipping down from cognitive consonance to cognitive dissonance. And the concept of cognitive dominance is sort of an instrument that can help you navigate through those waters. So what I do in the book is I talk about taking a problem or taking an event that doesn't make sense. So I took a page from Jordan Peterson, who I'm a great admirer of. He's written a book called 12 Rules of Life, which is a very good book. I highly recommend. And he wrote a book before that called Maps of Meaning. And Jordan Peterson talks about, and this is goes back further to Carl Jung, that we're all on this path from where we are to where we want to be. And when events occur in our life that are consistent with our path to get to where we want to be, we have hope. But when events come that are not consistent, that interfere, that's when we get anxious and we get fearful. So when we have those events, what I propose doing is really dissecting them and analyzing them into a very systematic way. And what you need to do is really literally draw a map, an X and Y map, which I call, the Cartesian coordinate system. And when you draw that X and Y axis, you could ask yourself a couple things about this event. One is, what are the objective components of the event, and what are the subjective components of the event? So when I say objective, that is, what are the universal, undeniable facts about the event? If we took this event and we showed it to somebody in Australia or in Alaska or wherever, what will we all agree upon? Okay. And then the subjective is, well, what does it mean to you? So, simple example, a glass of water, okay, a nice big tall glass of water. Well, objectively, that glass of water maybe is 500 cc's in volume. It's sitting in a clear container. It has a temperature of 95 degrees, and it's potable and clear. And we could take it to anybody around the world, and they would say that that's exactly true. But when you say, okay, well, what's the subjective meaning of that water? That's a whole different story. I mean, if I don't have access to clean and potable water, that's a very valuable glass of water to me. Or if I have a glass of water that's right here that I'm sipping, I've had water a little while ago, it's not as important to me. So the first question you need to ask when an event happens that you don't understand, it's not consistent with your path, is what are the objective and subjective components of it? And then what you want to look at is this something that I know, or is it something that's completely unknown to me? And then lastly, you want to ask yourself, is this an obstacle or a tool? And by looking at those and really mapping that out, you can drop it into a Cartesian coordinate system. If you put the x-axis being the objective and the y-axis being the subjective, the meaning side of things, you can drop a point on that map. You can map that event onto that Cartesian coordinate system. And if you happen to be in the positive x, which is objectively good, and the subjectively positive, you're in the upper right-hand corner of that quadrant. And that's what I call flow. That's what Mihai Csikszentmihalyi talked about many years ago, when you can do no wrong, when everything's going right. And don't let your brain think at that point. Let things happen and just react, because your body and your mind are in sync. You're in cognitive consonance and you're functioning very effectively. But there are other times in our lives when something objectively is good and something objectively is good and something subjectively is bad. When I talked about the job promotion, when you start working for somebody who you know you can't work for. Objectively, you got better pay, maybe you're higher status, but you're not feeling good about it. That's the lower right-hand quadrant. And I call that the calm before the storm, because something's got to happen before you can get back into the cognitive consonance realm. Sometimes we get something that hits us that's objectively negative and subjectively negative, like we get a diagnosis of cancer, or a loved one gets a diagnosis of cancer, and then we're objectively negative and subjectively negative. That's what I call the all is lost quadrant. That's another quadrant that we need to think about very, very carefully and figure out how we can move ourselves out of that quadrant. And then there are other events that happen that are objectively negative but subjectively positive. So these are events that athlete has an injury and is unable to compete in the major event that they were training for, let's say. But as a result, they end up maybe finding a new coach and spending more time perfecting their skills, and they come back even better. And those are the events and the experiences in our life that we say, oh my gosh, that was terrible when it happened, but it's the best thing that ever happened to me. And that's the upper left-hand quadrant, and that's what I call the birthing a new skill set quadrant. And once we birth that new skill set, we move back into the flow quadrant. And it's this heroic journey that we have, that we have to go through these different quadrants as we learn these events in our lives and as we navigate through them. And just by picking them apart, we can function more effectively when we make our decisions.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's always helpful, I think, to have kind of typologies, to have ways to provide framings around these types of concepts. So the quadrant system, I think, is really useful in that way. It can be a really helpful mental exercise. And I think anytime we're dealing with the way our mind works, and retraining our mind to think differently, to act so that we can act differently, it requires us to interrupt ingrained thought patterns and thought processes. And so these types of tools can be really helpful. And initially you might have to it might be hard work to go through the process of what you just described and trying to understand what you're doing and why, and how the different components relate to each other. But over time of exercising our mind that way, we will retrain our mind to be able to deal with those types of situations more effectively. And so it's worth that attention and that effort up front to make sure that we are, in a better place down the road to make better decisions, as you mentioned. So I'm curious then, in relation to decision making and to leadership more generally, how do you find yourself building off of that framework, the quadrant system, and that kind of mental exercise, that mental tool? How do you find transitioning from that into your decision making in real time and your leadership in real time?
Sure. Well, I think I could best address that by sort of just telling you the story of an experience that I had, as a young surgeon, and just sort of it sort of takes you through the whole arc. So early on in my career, and within the first few months, I had a gentleman by the name of Jesus Rodriguez who came to my emergency room. He had jumped into a pool and fractured his neck. And I met him in the ER on a hot summer night, and he was quadriplegic. Couldn't move his arms and his legs, couldn't feel his arms and his legs. And he had a fractured dislocation at C4-5. The vertebra had actually jumped off and had pushed on his spinal cord. I took him rapidly to the operating room. I reduced his fracture, put his spine back in alignment, and I fused his spine so that there was no longer any movement there, and took the pressure off of his spinal cord. But while I was doing the surgery, I knew that his chances for recovery were probably like 1 in 500 or 1 in 1,000. But miraculously, a few days later, he started wiggling his fingers and wiggling his toes, and he actually walked out of the hospital about 2 weeks after the surgery. And there was a picture of me and Jesus walking out of the hospital together, and I received a copy of it on my desk from my neurology colleague, who wrote, "What's this? McLaughlin saves Jesus?" And I wrote a note back to him saying, "Never underestimate the arrogance of a neurosurgeon." But truth be told, Jesus was a very lucky man, and I was a very lucky young surgeon to take care of him and for him to get better. And I thought, wow, I'm on top of the world here. I just finished my training, 8 years of training, 7 in Pittsburgh and 1 at Emory. And I'm on top of the world, and this is what I love doing. I'm a neurosurgeon, and I just saved somebody from being paralyzed. This feels great. And a week or two later, this young boy, Anthony, came into my emergency room. He had fallen off a school bus, and he had cut his face. But his parents were at the bedside, and they said to me, "Dr. McLaughlin, our boy is not right. I mean, there's something really wrong. He's sleeping too much. He's acting clumsy. We have a pizza parlor down the street, and he's dropping plates, and he can't bust tables like he used to, and there's something really wrong with him." So we got a quick MRI scan, and it showed that Anthony had a brain tumor, deeply seated right in the back of his brain, pressing on his brainstem. And just this really neat kid. He had a great smile and a great sense of humor. And you could tell he was uncomfortable, but he had a really magnetic personality, and I was immediately attached to him. And I knew I had all the training to take care of him. I had trained at the University of Pittsburgh, Dr. Leland Albright, outstanding pediatric neurosurgeon, and I knew I could take care of Anthony and take that tumor out. The next day or two, I got him ready for surgery and took him to the operating room. I positioned him in the prone position with his head down and positioned him exactly the way I wanted. And I made the incision and I came down and I was literally in flow. I was opening everything up. I opened the bone. I came down on this very angry, bloody tumor, and I surrounded it and I took all of its blood supply, and then I gutted the tumor, sort of like scooping it out with a little micro instrument under the microscope. And then I surrounded it a little bit more and I shrunk it a little bit more. And I got this devil and I shaved it off of his brainstem and I got this thing out of him, and the operation went perfectly. And he woke up neurologically intact. And I walked out of the hospital again that day going, I feel great. I love this. This is exactly what I was here to do in my life. But the next day, Anthony began having some very serious complications. He began to shriek every time the nurses tried to examine his arms and his legs, and he stopped talking. He wasn't himself at all, and I took him back for a scan, and the MRI scan showed that the tumor was all gone. And all of his labs were good and everything, but he just wasn't acting right. And he developed a very rare complication called cerebellar mutism, which is this unusual complication where children don't speak and they don't move. And every time you try to move them, they just shriek at the top of their lungs. And, I reassured his parents saying that this should settle down. This should get better. But it was really one of the worst cases I had seen. And a day or two later, he began developing a fluid buildup on the brain. And I had to take him back to the operating room and put a shunt in to bypass the fluid. And then a few days later, his pathology came back, anaplastic tumor, which is, one shade less than malignant, which is bad. It means it's more likely to recur. A few days later, he got another complication where the shunt clogged, and I had to take him back to the operating room. And this poor boy, over the course of 3 months, had every single complication you could imagine: wound infection, wound weakness, leaking wound, needed multiple surgeries. And I just saw this beautiful boy just have one neurological devastating event after another, and I just saw him slipping through my fingers. And he's suffering. He suffered. And his parents suffered. And it was a really hard thing for me to see. And then at the end of the 3 months, he finally stabilized, and his mom and dad, they said, Dr. McLaughlin, we want to get a picture of you with Anthony. And so I sat at his bedside and I held his hand and I faked this smile because I knew there was nothing good coming for this kid. He was going to be off for chemotherapy and radiation. He had multiple insults to his brain with all these complications. And, he was never, ever going to be the boy that I expected he could be after a perfect operation. And I had this terrible feeling, like what could I have done better? Could I have operated quicker? Could I have relaxed the pressure on the brain sooner? Could I have retracted less? Could I have picked up his infection sooner? There was constant questions that I had, and I had this terrible feeling that I hurt him. I felt that I could have been a better surgeon. I could have, done more. And that's one of the hardest things a surgeon has to experience sometimes, is sometimes what we do actually causes suffering in people, and we have to live with that. And that was when I was like, wait a minute, this is not what I wanted to have in my life. Like, this is not what I envisioned as a doctor. I didn't expect to feel like this. I want to crawl into a rock. I don't feel right. So I was down in that, I went from flow down to that quadrant of calm before the storm. Objectively, I had all the training and the skills, but subjectively, I felt terrible because I felt like I could have done more for him. And it affected me really severely. I began to take these long walks at night, and I would I'd have an extra cocktail, or I'd chew tobacco, and I would chew tobacco to try and like get over it. I had all these poor coping strategies. And so I felt, even though I was around a loving wife, a loving family, and great partners, I felt really, really alone, which I think people feel sometimes when you do everything right and something bad still happens. So I ended up, again, suppressing that stuff. I ended up stopping doing pediatric neurosurgery. I couldn't bear to have another Anthony. So I ended up stopping pediatric neurosurgery, and I ultimately moved to New Jersey. And, I carried that with me. And every time I looked at that picture on my wall, I felt bad. I felt sad, and I didn't feel good about myself. And so I carried that for a while. And then fast forward 15 years, and I started writing this book about fear and grief and how to deal with it. And I realized I had to go back and find out what happened to Anthony. When I moved to New Jersey, I just sort of figured he probably didn't do well and probably passed away. So I got on the internet, and I got on Facebook, and I looked up the pizza parlor that the family had, and I scrolled into the pictures, and sure enough, I saw a picture of his parents. And I scrolled down a little farther, and I saw a 24-year-old man in a wheelchair with his parents. And I realized, oh my God, Anthony's still alive. I couldn't believe it. I called his parents. I called the pizza parlor that day, and I said, hey, Mr. and Mrs. DeCory, I want to come up and visit you. I need to speak with you. I've been writing this book, and I've thought about you and Anthony for a long time. Can I come visit? And so I drove up that weekend, and I saw them, and I saw Anthony, and he's got some neurological deficits, but he's still part of his family, and he's still Dad's number one guy at the pizza parlor. And I talked to his family, his mom and dad, and I said, I wanted you to know that when I left, I always felt bad, and I felt like I let you down. I felt like I could have done more to save your boy. And they came around the table, and they gave me this gigantic hug, and they said, what are you talking about, Dr. McLaughlin? You're our hero. You saved our boy, and he's still with us. And we know you did everything you could. And they gave me some presents to go home with. They gave me a plant from their restaurant that had been there since they started their restaurant. And they gave me an Italian purse that they had got in Italy for my wife, Julie. And they gave me a picture that I had forgotten about. And this was this picture of me with Anthony and the whole family and my family that we had sort of a last dinner there before we moved to New Jersey. And that had been hanging on their wall. And so I got in my car, and I just looked at myself, and I thought, oh my God, like, you had this whole thing wrong. You thought you failed Anthony, but you released your gift to Anthony, and you did everything you could, and he's still here, and you did what you were supposed to. And that feeling was just this incredible feeling of gratitude, and my understanding of my purpose to serve. It's not always to cure, it's to serve, and that was this unbelievable lesson. And then I called my co-writer, Sean Coyne. I told him about the whole experience, and he said, wow, that's amazing. I think we should put the story of Anthony and the story of Jesus together. And I said, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense to me, Sean. It's like, you got this triumph, and then you still have this story of this boy who didn't do well. And he said, Mark, you don't get it, do you? I'm like, no, what? He said, Mark, you tell a story of Jesus, and you take somebody who's paralyzed and you make him walk again, and you say it's luck. And then you take a young boy who has a terrible tumor, and you do everything you can for him, and he has complications that are out of your control, and you say it's your fault. That's an impossible standard to live up to. Impossible. So that was when I birthed a new skill set, and I realized, wow, like, I've got to be kinder to myself, and I've got to not hold myself to that impossible standard. And, on that day, neurosurgery and the practice and my training, and I just got a lot better at what I do. And I think a lot of people out there, they have experiences very similar, in the same archetype of Anthony. They do something, They do everything they possibly can. Something bad happens, and then they hold themselves responsible for this impossible standard. So I would ask your listeners today, like, who are your Anthonys? What are the things that you carried with you and told yourself a story that you weren't good enough when you actually really were? And when you realize those events, you become a better leader, in my opinion. And I became a better leader and a better doctor. And it was going through that whole archetype, from flow to calm before the storm to all is lost to birthing a new skill set and moving back into the flow phenomenon. So I wish I had known this when I was experiencing my experience, but thank goodness I know it now, and I can share it with you and your listeners.
Well, thank you so much for sharing those stories. That takes a great deal of vulnerability to be willing to share that. And I think there is a lot we can learn from the experiences that you had. And you're absolutely right. We need to learn to be forgiving to ourselves, right? And we need to be compassionate towards ourselves. And that's not to say that we shouldn't hold ourselves accountable. As leaders, we do make decisions that impact people. And if we're negligent in our duties and in how we go about making those decisions, and it has negative impacts, we do need to own up to that, and we do need to take responsibility for that, just as I'm sure you would as a doctor if you truly were negligent in the care of a patient. But what you shared was not negligence. It was simply external factors outside of your control. And, in leadership, we deal with that all the time too. Like, there's so many variables, there's so many different aspects that are influencing our decision making at any given point in time. And then there's just so many external factors that we can never possibly control. And so what we do is put our best foot forward, make the best possible decision we can within the context that we are, given, and then we try to learn from it and hopefully make good decisions, but then grow from whatever occurs. And we need to be compassionate with ourselves and own up to mistakes when they happen, but also not just bombard ourselves with the guilt that might come from not being perfect, because frankly, none of us will ever be perfect, and we're going to make mistakes, and it's just the way it is. And even if we don't make an actual mistake, we do the best we possibly can do under the circumstances, as good as anyone could possibly do. Things still aren't always going to work out the best or the way that we had hoped, just like in the story that you shared. And so if we can remember that, then we can help ourselves to not become debilitated by a fear of failure, and just recognizing that setbacks, failures are just part of the game that we play as leaders. And sometimes you take 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but you learn from that experience, and then hopefully next time you're equipped to deal with the difficulties that arise in the future. Well, thank you so much, Mark, for everything you shared today. It's a pleasure. It's been a pleasure, and I would love to keep talking, but I suspect you have other things you need to get on with your day as a busy surgeon. So I'm going to let you go. But before we part ways today, I wanted to give you the last word and give you a chance to share with the listeners how they can get connected with you, find out more about your book, and anything else that you'd like to share.
Sure. So again, I would just say that cognitive dominance it's not like an enlightenment sort of thing. I still feel like I'm a student of it. It's something that you can continue to work on. And I have a cognitive dominance assessment that you can access on my website, which can ask you some questions and kind of give you an analysis of where you are and some feedback on where you can improve. That's what my website is, markmclaughlinmd.com. And there's a lot of the story of Anthony and the methodology of thinking about fear and how to navigate off of it is certainly described in the book Cognitive Dominance, which is available on Amazon. I have a blog that focuses on performance, and there are a number of recorded lectures that I've given on performance enhancement in different realms in sports and business and in hospital management and medicine. So I'd be happy to share those with you. They should be on the website, markmclaughlinmd.com. And I would just leave with it was funny because I wanted that term to be the title of the book, Cognitive Dominance, a brain surgeon's quest to outthink fear, knowing that may be scaring people away, but I really thought it was important to bring out this big idea and share it with people, and to understand that these are universal problems. And the luck I've had, the blessing I've had, is that I've been able to kind of learn it in a cauldron of, or a jungle of decision making difficulties. And so I think that the points are they're transferable to business and parenting, and I hope you enjoy the material in the book or in the quiz. Thank you for the time today. I really appreciate it, Jonathan.
Thank you again, Mark. It's been a pleasure. I hope my listeners will reach out to Mark, get connected, find out more about what he might be able to do for you, check out his book. And I wish everyone a wonderful week. I hope everyone stays healthy and safe, and that you can all continue to find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. Thank you.
We are excited to announce the launch of Human Capital Innovation's new e-magazine, Human Capital Leadership. Human Capital Leadership is a free, interactive e-magazine with the mission to help individuals, leaders, and organizations find innovative approaches to maximize their human capital potential. We will be publishing issues quarterly in August, November, February, and May. We hope you'll check out our first issue, and please let us know what you think. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. I hope you stay healthy and safe, and that you have a great week. Check out our new weekly LinkedIn newsletter, Alchemizing Human Capital, exploring industry trends via original research and interviews with executives and thought leaders from across the globe. We look forward to having you join us.